Good morning. My name's Sal D'Agostino, and I'm joined today by Jim Barnett from. Well, I'll let you guys introduce yourself. I'm Sal D'Agostino. I have a company called ID Machines. I'm also the president and chair of the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, and we're going to be talking today about what it means to be a relying party and how some of the work that we're doing in the IDESG can help in that sense. Thank you for all being here. I realize this is the last time slot and the last day, and even myself, and looking at the other presentations, I thought they were pretty good, and was wondering whether I could somehow figure out a way to be there too. Um, but thank you for being here, Jim.
Hi, Jim Barnett with the AARP. I work in our enterprise strategy group, and I'm also on the board of IDESG.
Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Madlin with Symantec. I am in business development in our identity solutions, predominantly focused around our public sector business based here in DC. And I'm also a board member of the IDSG.
Thank you guys both for being here. So the talk is about welcome to the relying party. Does everybody in the room know what you're talking about when we say a relying party? I mean, it's kind of an identity conference, and most people would, right? But just to check.
Is anybody
here not familiar with the concept of a relying party? Sure. So as a relying party, you're someone who's a consumer, right, of credentials for the most part. You're relying on other services. Jim is AARP is a huge relying party, right? He's got millions of customers. He's got identity service providers. He's got all sorts of services that people come to him to provide. So, I mean, as opposed to an identity provider, where you're issuing credentials or a few other things that I'm going to show in a diagram in a second. But it's the idea of a service provider who is very dependent on identity services, yet are not necessarily the source of all of those. Though in some cases, what you find out, in fact, you are that too. And I think that's kind of the point of what we're going to try to get here. So just sort of riffing on this idea of welcome to the relying party and who's invited. In fact, I mean, this is a spring fling. I mean, everybody's there, right? When you're a relying party, everybody's involved, right? You have your vendors involved, you have your customers involved, you have your employees involved, and I'm going to let Jim talk to the AARP scenario here in a little bit more detail, but just to set up the premise. You actually have to act as an IDP, and there's a wide range of stuff that you're going to end up having to deliver at the end of the day. And it could be a service provider for things. It could be a service provider in a virtual sense. It really covers almost all the context. So I thought that for this presentation and for this conference to look at a identity services scenario, taking the relying party's perspective probably could be as informative as any, right? Because, in fact, when you're an IDP, you're an identity ecosystem of your own, right? You have users, you have to act as a client to other services, you have resources that you serve, and you act as an IDP too. So, in the typical identity architecture, you get to deliver and be all of those components in one fell swoop. Right, and so I'm just going to go through these quickly, and then Jim, I'll ask you to elaborate from a real world context about them. So you have to act as an IDP, right? So even though you're a relying party, that doesn't mean that you don't have to go through the proofing and the enrollment and the registration and authentication and providing authorization services. I mean, you literally have to run an entire identity infrastructure on your own, and not the least of which is being able to either to issue or consume third-party credentials. You may, as a resource, any relying party is providing resources to their enterprise, but more and more, as you talk about identity management, it's external, it's consumer-facing. The same thing is true here again when an IDP is playing in that role. When an RP is playing in that role, they've got to do all those things, and it's the thing that's sort of breaking the mold, as I think we're all aware today, is that in the old days this used to be fairly hierarchical. You could be relying party, and it wasn't that complicated. But you introduce mobile, as devices, mobile as a workforce, outsourcing, all this other fun stuff. It's hardly hierarchical anymore. Um, so, I mean, and then as a client, right? So not only are you a relying party, but you also have client credentials of your own that you're going to be using, particularly as things get outsourced even further, right? And as I point out, this can be pretty far-ranging. And you know, to the extent to which when you're agreeing with other people to be using their services, how does that have an impact on the services that you provide, right? So there's this sort of second order relationship when you're a relying party and you're gathering services and bringing them on board. And then as a user, right? So I think when you're a relying party, you get to be all of the above. And at this point, I'd just like to turn it over to Jim to talk a little bit more about in the context of AARP, if in fact what I've just said is true, right?
No, it is true, Sal. And I guess the perspective I'd like to impart to you is that a lot of organizations that are relying parties like AARP may not know they're relying parties, or more importantly, I should say, the folks who are high-level decision makers may not realize that. So it's a bit of an educational process. So within AARP, we kind of started the identity business 60 years ago. We took one attribute, being 50 plus, and we built a business around it. But over time, as more and more identity services were brought to bear in the online world, we found a few years ago we were being besieged by companies that had great ideas, great services, but our executives just had no idea how to evaluate them one against the other. So a few years ago, we sort of said, "Hey, wait, time out. Let's just take a breather here. How do we know who we should listen to, who we can trust, if this is going to work, at scale or work with other things we're doing?" So one of the things we did in my enterprise strategy group was we basically said, "Okay, look at the NSTIC, look at the principles there. If nothing else, when you have somebody come into your office and say, 'I've got a service for you,' you can ask them, does it meet these 4 principles that NSTIC talked about, which then now roll into the very specific standards that IDESG has put forward in the registry. So again, I guess to sort of sum that up is that you really do have an educational challenge within the RP. And RPs, again, just really don't always know that they are a relying party and that they need to meet these standards if going forward they don't want to have to tear up their identity services and start all over again.
It's curious, Chip. I mean, you've got about as horizontal a user population as could possibly exist, right? I mean, age and then all shapes and sizes.
Right.
When you're setting up services, how do you take that into account, right? I mean, I guess whenever you're designing an identity system, you have to take into account the particular requirements of your user base. You've got a really interesting user base, right? So it's older, maybe computer savvy, maybe becoming less so with time, and then every shape, size, personality, nationality. How do you get your arms around that?
Well, we're still sorting that out, and where we are is we have 38 million members. And those members, the identities that they represent are really, it's an analog database. I mean, it was our mailing list from our legacy. And now we're switching over to people who register at AARP.org, most of whom are members, but is not necessarily the same population. So we have millions and millions of people who register, and they are mostly registered really at a low level of assurance. They can register for the site, and they can use the services there, but that doesn't necessarily let you do things like buy your insurance or navigate your investments, that sort of thing. So that's what we're trying to think about, and that's why the work of IDESG is so important. Is that a lot of these transactions are transactions that require a higher level of assurance are moving on the internet. How do we help our members access those in a seamless way that has a really great member experience? And so that's still TBD to some extent.
So the presentation basically is set up so it's in 2 parts, right? One is this riff on the relying party, and then the balance is this thing that we put together at IDESG that we believe is relevant. Rather than waiting for questions at the end, it's sort of like I'm happy to sort of stop here. I mean, how many people in the audience are relying parties, right? Yeah. One, most, okay. Do you mind if I ask you, like, what's your biggest challenge on a daily basis? Do you think, or what question do you have that you might like to learn